I'm Dr. Mark Trexler with the Climatographers. I've been working on climate change for more than 30 years. I founded the first specialized climate consultancy in the United States in 1991 and was most recently Director of Climate Risk for the global risk management firm of DNV. Today, I'm co-developing the Climate Web, an online knowledge management system for delivering climate change decision support. Today, there is almost no limit to the information and misinformation available to any of us when it comes to climate change, and we should all regularly check our thinking. The enormous sums of money and societal change at stake aggravate the ever-present challenges of confirmation bias, and climate change poses well-understood challenges to human decision-making in general. The Climatographers' assumption audits, leveraging the collective intelligence of the Climate Web, offer evidence-based insight into today's key climate topics. So let's jump in. For purposes of this assumptions audit, exploring ecosystem services payments as carbon offsets, I'm going to focus on Reseed Farm. Reseed is by no means the only group exploring in problematic ways how ecosystem services payments and carbon offsets relate to each other, but Reseed's white paper lays the topics out very clearly. Reseed is zeroing in on the fact that smallholder farmers around the world are stewards to a lot of carbon and that they're under a lot of pressure. And this is a totally legitimate point. Reseed also argues that existing carbon offset markets are not fair when it comes to the ecosystem services these smallholder farmers help provide. And this too is a fair point, in that the rules governing carbon markets today are focused on climate change mitigation, not on fairness. And here's why. About 20 years ago, I spent an hour calculating emissions reductions happening in the US, having nothing to do with carbon markets, but that could potentially qualify as carbon offsets, including on fairness grounds. If someone comes up with a carbon offset program to promote electric vehicles next year, for example, why shouldn't people who bought a Prius last year qualify? As this graphic shows, however, there are billions of tons that fall into the category of business as usual, and that if credited as carbon offsets, could easily negate the environmental integrity of a carbon market. Now let's come back to Reseed and ecosystem services payments. First, it's worth pointing out that there is obviously a large literature on the topic of ecosystem services generally, and on the topic of ecosystem services payments. There's also a literature on whether ecosystem services payments even work, but that question is beyond the scope of this assumptions audit. When you try and monetize ecosystem services, which can encompass everything from oxygen production to subsistence fisheries, not surprisingly, you get a huge number, as shown in this estimate from a 1997 paper. People have been talking for years about giving ecosystem services a financial value to compensate the stewards of those services for the value that they're helping deliver. And again, that's a totally legitimate idea. The problem has been that no one has been able to figure out who's going to pay for all those ecosystem services, a question that becomes obvious if global GDP is $18 trillion and ecosystem services are worth more than $33 trillion. Now let's come back to Reseed. Reseed is proposing to sell tokenized carbon credits to help pay for the ecosystem services delivered by smallholder farmers around the world. What's particularly interesting about Reseed, however, is that they're pitching their carbon as carbon assets rather than carbon offsets. In fact, they're arguing that their carbon asset credits are superior to carbon offset credits, in part because they're not based on counterfactual baselines, but on real, verifiable, existing assets. Reseed goes on to argue that the rules governing carbon offsets undermine efforts to really tackle climate change through carbon markets, and specifically that the three criteria for what makes a legitimate carbon offset, additionality, permanence, and leakage, are the reasons that carbon markets can't scale. And ironically, Reseed has a point. Reseed is arguing that the best way to reduce your carbon footprint or to make money investing in the carbon market is with carbon assets, not carbon offsets. And that's how you accomplish climate change mitigation at scale. But there is a fundamental problem in Reseed's logic. You can't just say a carbon asset isn't a carbon offset and then sell it as a carbon offset. That's what Reseed is doing. Reseed is explicitly saying that you can use their carbon asset credits to reduce your carbon footprint. While they don't use the word offset for obvious reasons, Reseed's carbon asset credits are not reducing your carbon footprint, they're offsetting it, pure and simple. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck, and that's certainly the case here. Here's the other problem, and it's a doozy. Reseed is talking about bringing billions of tons of CO2 credits to the voluntary carbon market by 2028. Now, 4 billion tons, 1 billion metric tons of carbon, may sound like a big number, but it's actually minuscule in terms of how many credits Reseed's approach to the whole idea of voluntary offset markets could theoretically deliver to the market. Reseed is suggesting opening a massive backdoor for non-additional tons into voluntary carbon markets. Remember that Reseed wants you to buy credits based on carbon already stored in soils and vegetation. As you can see in this global carbon cycle diagram, that amounts to some 5,000 billion tons of CO2 in soils and 2,000 billion tons in vegetation. By contrast, current human emissions total about 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year. The problem is that you could buy credits for all 7,000 billion tons of stored carbon, and CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere would keep rising because of the 50 billion tons coming from human activities, and climate change would keep going. That's why additionality matters, because as soon as you get rid of additionality in a carbon market, it loses its direct link to climate change mitigation. And by the way, once you get rid of additionality, big ag will start asking to be paid for all of its existing soil carbon, and fossil fuel companies will start asking to be paid for the thousands of billions of tons of fossil fuel carbon still in the ground that might never have been produced under any circumstances. We could dive a little deeply into the details of this, and again, our intent is not to single out Reseed. But for purposes of this assumptions audit, the answer is clear. You shouldn't confuse ecosystem services with carbon offsets. You can't reduce or offset your carbon footprint by buying ecosystem services credits. And to say that ecosystem services credits are a speculative investment would, in general, be a gross understatement.